When the first large groups of German prisoners stepped onto American soil in 1943 and 1944, most of them carried the same expectation. Captivity meant hunger, humiliation, or brutality. Many had heard rumors from Goebbels' propaganda ministry warning that Americans tortured prisoners or sent them to starvation camps. Others had survived the Eastern Front, where surrender often meant execution. To them, the very idea of being captured by an enemy felt like stepping into darkness. What they found instead was the United States Army's prisoner of war system, coldly bureaucratic, meticulously organized, and bound tightly to the rules of the 1929 Geneva Convention. No German POW arriving in New York, Norfolk, Boston, or New Orleans could have imagined how different their new reality would be. The journey usually began far away, the deserts of Tunisia, the mountains of Italy, or the hedgerows of Normandy. Captured soldiers were first processed in North Africa or England, then loaded onto Liberty ships under heavy guard for the Atlantic crossing. Even the voyage contradicted their expectations. They were fed 3 times a day. They received medical checks. U-boat threat alarms did not lead to panic or cruelty. American guards followed procedure, locking POW compartments not to trap them, but to prevent interference during emergencies. When ships reached the East Coast, Red Cross inspectors were present on the docks, clipboards in hand, ensuring the U.S. complied with every article of the Geneva Convention. Many POWs later wrote that this was the moment they realized America intended to treat them not as enemies, but as prisoners protected by law. Then came the trains. Long lines of POWs boarded Pullman cars or converted troop trains, passing through landscapes that seemed impossibly vast. Cotton fields in Georgia, endless plains in Texas, rolling farmland in Iowa, snow-covered forests in Wisconsin. Some Germans thought America looked like a continent built from scratch for abundance. Others noticed something stranger. Civilians waved at them from station platforms. Children pointed curiously. Mothers handed newspapers to guards. Farmers stood along fences watching the trains go by. This was not the hostile, collapsing capitalist society Nazi propaganda had promised them. When the trains finally slowed before the barbed wire fences of camps like Camp Butner in North Carolina, Camp Algona in Iowa, Camp Swift in Texas, Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, or Camp Fort Robinson in Nebraska, the POWs braced themselves for the worst. Yet again, the reality was different. The camps were not muddy pens or makeshift stockades. They were structured mini-towns. There were barracks with heating stoves, latrines with running water, fully staffed infirmaries, kitchens, bakeries, even small theaters. The U.S. Army had built approximately 500 POW camps across 46 states, each meticulously governed by War Department Technical Manual 19-500, issued in 1944. Inside the gates, every process was codified: work schedules, disciplinary rules, medical care, mail procedures, recreation policies, and, most shocking of all, the pay system. The Germans arriving had no idea what was coming. They expected harsh treatment. What they received instead was orientation. American officers read, through interpreters, the rights guaranteed to them under the Geneva Convention. Article 11. POWs must receive living conditions equivalent to those of the detaining power's own troops. Article 28. POWs may work but must be compensated. Article 34. POWs must be paid wages in a currency usable in camp canteens. Article 43. Discipline must be humane. To the German enlisted men, these words sounded like theory, not reality. They had lived through years of shortages. They had seen frontline soldiers of the Wehrmacht operating on half rations in 1944. They had starved in the Kessel traps of the Eastern Front. They had watched comrades freeze in the Ardennes, suffer in Italy, collapse under Allied bombing in Normandy. How could their captors, enemies, offer more comfort than their own collapsing homeland? But within days, the truth became unmistakable. They received uniforms marked PW, sturdy boots, blankets, combs, razors, and soak. They were issued winter jackets in cold states, sun hats in Texas. In the mess halls, they received meals that mirrored the caloric standards of American soldiers, including meat, potatoes, beans, bread, margarine, and sometimes fruit. The portions were not generous, but compared to the rationing inside Germany in 1944-45, they were plentiful. Many POWs gained weight within weeks of arrival. And then came the biggest shock. After their first work assignment, hauling lumber, cleaning barracks, assisting in kitchens, or unloading supplies, many were summoned to a counter outside the camp canteen. An American corporal handed each man slips of colored paper printed with canteen coupon, or camp scrip. The value? 80 cents per day, the standard wage mandated by TM 19500. 80 cents. To men who had expected starvation, this felt absurdly generous. It was not real U.S. currency. POWs were not allowed to possess dollars, but it could be spent freely inside the camp store on cigarettes, writing paper, soap, combs, candy, stationery, razor blades, canned fruit, or even musical instruments available in some camps. German soldiers exchanged glances, whispered in disbelief, and stared at the slips in their hands as though they were counterfeit. "They pay us?" one POW muttered in confusion. "For working?" Another answered, "Americans must be insane or very rich." The truth was simpler. The U.S. Army was following the law. Geneva Convention rules, once abstract text on a page, were now tangible realities inside their pockets. That moment, the first time German prisoners realized they were being paid by the very army they had been fighting, left a deep impression. No German soldier arriving in the United States had expected fair treatment. Fewer still had expected wages. The shock would only grow as they learned the full extent of the system behind those 80 cents per day, a system that would shape every part of their captivity in the years to come. For German prisoners expecting punishment or deprivation, the discovery that American POW camps operated under a strict, lawful framework felt almost surreal. But nothing about the system was improvised. Every detail, from the layout of barracks to the calories in each meal, from work schedules to recreation time, and especially the payments POWs received, was dictated by a binding structure grounded in the 1929 Geneva Convention and meticulously enforced through the U.S. War Department's Technical Manual 19-500, issued in 1944. These were not suggestions, they were obligations, and the United States followed them with bureaucratic precision. Article 11 of the Geneva Convention required that POWs be treated with conditions equal to those of the detaining power's own troops. Article 28 stated clearly that POWs could be assigned to non-military labor and must receive compensation. Article 34 mandated that POWs be allowed to purchase personal items through a camp canteen system. Article 43 prohibited brutal discipline, arbitrary punishment, or degradation. For American commanders, these articles were not negotiable. The U.S. military knew that millions of its own soldiers were fighting overseas, and thousands of Americans were themselves POWs in German hands. Every humane action taken in U.S. camps strengthened America's diplomatic position and helped protect its own captured servicemen through reciprocity. But for German POWs, these standards were unbelievable. Many had grown up in Hitler Youth training, taught that democracies were weak and hypocritical. Yet, upon arriving in American camps, they were greeted with a system that functioned like a miniature economy. The heart of that system was scrip, camp money, printed in colored ink, stamped with denominations of 5 cents, 10 cents, 25 cents, 50 cents, and larger vouchers used to balance weekly wages. TM 19500 required that POWs performing authorized labor be paid 80 cents per day, regardless of rank, paid as scrip rather than U.S. dollars. The scrip was intentionally designed to prevent escapees from purchasing supplies outside the camp, but inside the fences, it acted as real currency. Canteens operated like compact department stores, stocked with goods acquired by the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, cigarettes, tailored for POW consumption, to avoid shortages among American troops. Shaving soap, toothbrushes, razor blades, stationery, envelopes, shoe polish, chocolate, canned goods, and sometimes even harmonicas or chess sets. A POW could walk in, place scrip on the counter, and walk out with a pouch of tobacco or a bar of soap that would have cost a full day's wages in bombed-out Germany, if it could be found at all. TM 19500 defined everything: how POWs clocked work hours, how wages were recorded, how scrip was distributed, how shortages were handled, and how authorities resolved disputes. American officers maintained detailed ledgers tracking labor output, wage payments, and canteen inventories. Bookkeeping so exact that historians today can reconstruct daily camp activity from surviving documents. For German POWs, this level of organization was disorienting. The Third Reich, by late 1944, was a study in collapse. Fuel shortages, food rationing, broken transportation networks, and constant Allied air raids had reduced Germany to chaos. Yet here, in enemy captivity, everything ran with almost industrial efficiency. A POW assigned to a labor detachment might wake up at 5:30 a.m., eat breakfast, assemble in formation, and then march to his worksite under guard. Hours were recorded, breaks were regulated, and at the end of the shift, his name appeared on a payroll list in the administrative hut. On Friday afternoons, camp clerks distributed envelopes containing that week's wages in scrip. The first distribution was always the shocking. German soldiers lined up, unsure what to expect. Some expected discipline. Others expected a search or inspection. Instead, an American NCO called out names and handed each man a small stack of coupons. Most POWs stared at them in silence, turning the colorful slips in their hands as if they were stage props. 80 cents, the interpreter explained. Your pay for this week. It felt like a joke. Even the guards expected disbelief. One Iowa farmer watching POW laborers pick sugar beets outside Camp Algona recalled a young German asking timidly, "This is real money? We may use it." The guard nodded. "Yes, in the canteen." The German walked away stunned. He had marched hundreds of miles in Italy without pay. He had fought in Normandy on half rations. Now the enemy, wealthy, distant America, paid him to work in a field. This was not generosity, it was law. But to the POWs, it felt like something closer to civilization itself. And the effect was immediate. Scrip became a stabilizing force inside the camps. Men who might have grown restless instead debated which brand of tobacco to buy. Others saved their wages to purchase writing paper and send letters home. A few tried to save scrip as souvenirs, only to be told it was worthless outside the fences. But the symbolism mattered. In a war defined by brutality, the idea that labor and wages still meant something was disarming. German officers, some staunch Nazis, resented the system. They believed paying enlisted men undermined discipline. But American camp commanders were unmoved. Geneva rules applied to everyone. Even SS prisoners grudgingly received scrip. For many POWs, the moment they received their first wages became the turning point in their understanding of captivity. They were not being punished. They were being managed. They were not being starved. They were being maintained. They were not being exploited. They were participating, however unwillingly, in an economic structure that treated them as human beings with needs, routines, and rights. And that realization would carry them into the next stage of their captivity, the daily work routine that made them both essential to the American home front and unexpectedly comfortable within the boundaries of the POW system, a world where labor meant stability, wages meant autonomy, and the enemy's economy felt shockingly humane.
By the winter of 1944, the rhythm of life for German prisoners in American camps had settled into something none of them expected: a structured, predictable routine governed not by cruelty or chaos, but by rules, clocks, and wages. Every morning, well before sunrise, the barracks at camps like Butner, Algona, and Swift echoed with the sounds of boots hitting wooden floors, stoves being stoked, and POWs lining up for roll call. The men who only months before were manning MG-42s in Normandy or hauling ammunition in Italy now stood in neat rows under the watchful, but rarely hostile, eyes of American guards armed with garans. The day began with breakfast: oatmeal or eggs, coffee, bread, occasionally fruit. It matched the caloric standards of U.S. troops per Geneva Convention requirements. After eating, prisoners formed into work details, small labor units that would shape their daily life in ways that surprised them. The work was varied, often dull, but far less punishing than what they had known in the Wehrmacht. In Camp Algona, POWs loaded grain sacks, cut wood, harvested corn, or repaired fences on nearby Iowa farms. In Texas, at Camp Swift, they picked cotton, cleared brush, and helped maintain ranch land. At Camp Butner, in North Carolina, they worked in sawmills, kitchens, laundry huts, and even as mechanics, assisting U.S. Army technicians with non-sensitive repairs. Whatever the job, it was supervised closely to ensure compliance with Geneva rules. No military production, no dangerous tasks intended to harm POWs, no forced labor beyond reasonable hours. Most prisoners worked 6 days a week. Sundays were reserved for religious services, football games, chess tournaments, or simply reading. This consistency felt almost unreal to men who had served in a collapsing Germany where days bled into each other without order or hope. What astonished them most was that every hour of labor counted, literally. American administrative clerks kept detailed rosters. At the end of each shift, POWs were checked off on timecard-style sheets, and every hour worked contributed to their daily pay, always 80 cents, no more, no less, per War Department TM 19,500-1944. The moment of payment became a weekly ritual. On Friday afternoons, prisoners lined up outside the canteen or the administrative hut. The air buzzed with murmurs, some anxious, some amused, some still incredulous after months in captivity. An American sergeant or corporal called out names one by one. As each POW stepped forward, he received an envelope or handful of coupons, brightly colored script notes printed specifically for the camp economy. These weren't dollars. They couldn't be used outside, and that was the point. But within the barbed wire, they were as good as cash. The first time most Germans received their wages, they were stunned into silence. Many thought it was a trick. Some thought it was propaganda designed to soften them, but the guards simply shrugged and moved to the next man. Geneva Convention. You work, you get paid. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. For the first time since joining the German army, some POWs felt treated like workers rather than expendable soldiers. In the Wehrmacht's later years, men fought hungry, marched for days without rest, and saw entire units abandoned due to shortages. Now the enemy, America, paid them on time, every time, with machine-like reliability. Word spread quickly. You can buy cigarettes with this. I bought soap. I bought a razor. They even have chocolate sometimes. The camp canteens were small but astonishingly well stocked. Shelves held tins of sardines, tobacco pouches, chewing gum, envelopes, writing pads, combs, shoe polish, candy bars, postcards, and soap. Items that were luxuries in wartime Germany. Some camps even had small makeshift libraries where POWs could check out English or German books. Many POWs used their wages to write home, buying stationery and stamps. Letters often contained the same repeated line: "We are being treated correctly." A few added, "Better than we were treated at home." Guards noticed that payday reduced tension. Men with scrip in their pockets argued less, fought less, and followed rules more easily. The ability to choose, even something minor, like which brand of cigarettes to buy, restored a sense of personal agency that war had stripped from them. Not all reacted positively. Hardcore Nazi prisoners, especially officers, despised the system. They considered working for the Americans dishonorable. Some tried to intimidate other prisoners into refusing wages. But TM 19500 supported the American approach. Enlisted men could be required to work. And when wages came, most POWs accepted them without hesitation. They were pragmatic. They were hungry for normalcy. And American scrip, as strange as it looked, became their first step towards it. Farm work details produced especially memorable scenes. American farmers would watch POWs collect their scrip at end of day, the young Germans smiling awkwardly as though embarrassed to be paid by the nation they had been taught to hate.
One Iowa farmer later recalled asking a POW, "What did you buy with your pay?" The German answered, shyly, "Soap and chocolate, things we haven't seen in years." In many cases, U.S. guards were less strict than German NCOs had been. Civilians sometimes offered POWers lemonade or sandwiches during summer farm shifts, prompting strict reprimands from the guards. Geneva Convention rules allowed labor, but not fraternization. Still, the encounters left a strong impression on the POWs. The America they had imagined, a cruel, collapsing society of gangsters and propaganda, did not exist. Instead, they found themselves working in calm, rural communities where civilians treated them with curiosity rather than hatred. The wages were the clearest symbol of that difference. They made captivity feel structured instead of chaotic, humane instead of degrading. And for many POWs, earning 80 cents per day as farmhands, carpenters, kitchen workers, or sawmill assistants became the first stable routine they had known in years. The realization grew slowly, but surely. They were living better, eating better, and being paid more consistently than many of their fellow soldiers still fighting for the Reich. And this shock, this reversal of everything they expected, began to reshape their understanding of America, of the war, and even of themselves.
To German prisoners, the fact that the United States paid them wages felt almost absurd. A mistake, a trick, or some bizarre act of generosity. But inside the offices of the Provost Marshal General in Washington, and within every camp command post across the country, the logic behind the policy was anything but emotional. The wages were not kindness, they were strategy, law, and practicality, woven together into a system that benefited the United States as much as it surprised the men who earned them. The foundation was simple: the 1929 Geneva Convention. The United States was one of the loudest advocates for its adoption, and its military bureaucracy treated it with near religious seriousness. The convention explicitly required that POWs be compensated for labor, compensation that had to be meaningful within camp boundaries and proportional to local living standards. TM 19500, the War Department's manual governing POW operations, converted these principles into exact numbers: 80 cents per day issued as scrip, no exceptions. The U.S. Army did not improvise. It obeyed the manual line by line. But compliance with the Geneva Convention was only part of the story. The United States had a deeper, more pragmatic reason for paying POWs: American labor shortages. By 1944, over 11 million Americans were in uniform. Farms, factories, railroads, and construction sites across the country were starving for manpower. With so many young men fighting overseas, the home front needed workers desperately. German POWs became the solution. Not just a symbolic solution, but a massive economic workforce. More than 400,000 Germans, scattered across camps in 46 states, provided millions of labor hours in agriculture, timber, maintenance, food processing, and infrastructure support. Paying them wages, via scrip, kept the system running smoothly. Money, even pretend money, gave POWs a stake in the routine. A man with wages was easier to motivate, easier to discipline, easier to occupy, and, most importantly, he was less likely to resist or sabotage tasks. American officers understood human psychology well. Give a prisoner meaningful work, predictable hours, decent food, and a small wage, and he becomes invested in the stability of the system. The U.S. achieved exactly that. Meanwhile, German military culture had conditioned its soldiers to believe capture was dishonorable, even shameful. But earning wages softened that internal conflict. Work became a source of structure. Pay became a source of dignity, however strange that dignity felt in captivity. There was another powerful reason America followed Geneva rules to the letter: reciprocity. Thousands of American airmen were held in Stalag Luft camps throughout Germany. Hundreds of soldiers captured in North Africa, Italy, or Normandy were behind barbed wire as well. By treating German POWs humanely and paying them fairly, the U.S. strengthened its diplomatic standing, making it harder for Germany to mistreat American prisoners. Every carton of American cigarettes bought by a POW with scrip helped ensure an American airman received a Red Cross parcel. And while the Nazi regime did not always honor Geneva rules fully, especially toward Eastern European captives, its treatment of American POWs was vastly better than its treatment of Soviet ones. Credit for that, in part, came from American compliance with Geneva standards. But if there was one place where the wages mattered most, it was the American Farm Belt. From Iowa to Texas, from Minnesota to Alabama, POWs harvested crops, cut timber, and worked industrial jobs that were essential to wartime supply lines. Farmers paid the U.S. Army a fixed rate per prisoner per day, and the Army pocketed the difference, turning POW labor into a revenue stream that quietly offset camp operating expenses. It was a triangle that worked for everyone. Farmers got reliable workers. Prisoners got wages they could spend on soap, cigarettes, or writing supplies. And the U.S. government got cheap labor during a national shortage. What astonished POWs most wasn't just the fact they were paid, but that civilians appreciated their work. At Camp Elgona, farmers sometimes asked for the same POW by name for future harvests. At Camp Swift, ranchers praised German laborers as hard-working and disciplined. Though rules banned fraternization, POWs occasionally received smiles, nods, or an extra cup of lemonade during the hottest months, small gestures that carried huge symbolic weight. The effect was unmistakable. German POWs felt something they had not expected to feel in captivity: usefulness. They were not locked away to rot. They were part of an economic engine. They contributed, and they were paid for it. American intelligence noted that morale among German prisoners often improved dramatically once they began working. Internal camp struggles, especially conflict stirred by die-hard Nazi prisoners attempting to dominate others, declined when men focused on wages, jobs, and personal routines instead of ideology. The most surprising effect showed up in letters home. Through censored but still honest correspondence, POWs wrote to their families in Germany describing humane treatment, full meals, clean barracks, and most bewilderingly of all, regular wages. These letters shocked civilians living amid bombings and starvation. American officials later admitted that such correspondence had significant propaganda value. Without intending to, the POW wage system became a silent weapon in the psychological war, demonstrating American stability and contrasting sharply with German hardships. Everything about the system, law, discipline, economics, and psychology, worked together seamlessly. The wages were not a kindness. They were a mechanism, a tool, a subtle instrument of control, diplomacy, and morale. And for the POWs themselves, that mechanism was transformative. Each coupon they held in their hands represented something they had not expected to receive from an enemy: structure, predictability, and a faint echo of ordinary life. Soon, that shock would deepen even more, because as months passed, many German POWs began to realize something even more astonishing. Life inside an American camp often offered more stability, more food, and more dignity than life as a soldier in Hitler's collapsing Reich.
By the time the war ended in Europe in May 1945 and German POWs began their long, staggered journey home between late 1945 and 1946, the shock of being paid for their labor, day after day, week after week, had reshaped their understanding of captivity, of America, and even of the war they had fought in. Many arrived in the United States expecting humiliation. Instead, they found themselves standing in orderly lines at camp canteens, collecting 80 cents of brightly colored scrip for honest work. This experience lingered in their minds long after the fences opened. And when they returned to a shattered Germany, that memory became even sharper. Most POWs returning to Bavaria, Hesse, Saxony, or the Ruhr found cities flattened, food rationed, factories gutted, and families struggling to survive on meager portions. Their homes had been bombed, their parents displaced, their younger siblings malnourished. Meanwhile, these same men had spent the past months or years living under a system where they had earned wages, bought cigarettes and chocolate, received adequate medical care, written letters home, and slept in warm barracks with functioning stoves. The contrast was staggering. For many, the moment of reverse culture shock struck when they reached their hometowns and compared their POW camp memories to the ruins in front of them. They had expected captivity to be the bottom. Instead, returning home often felt like stepping into a world far harsher than anything they had known in American hands. Historians examining post-war letters and memoirs repeatedly find a similar pattern. German POWs wrote that the U.S. camps, despite their fences, guards, and loss of freedom, had given them something deeply human: routine, stability, and above all, the dignity of being compensated for their labor. In memoir after memoir, they describe payday with a peculiar pride. One former POW recalled, "My first wage in America felt like a miracle. It was the first time in years I felt like a person again." Another wrote, "We were prisoners, but they gave us the dignity of workers." And another, reflecting decades later, "The Americans paid us for work when our own army could not even feed us." These details amazed families back home. Many German civilians had no idea such treatment was possible. Some believed POWs were exaggerating. Others were angered to discover that their men had been eating better in captivity than they were in bombed-out cities. Yet the truth spread, and with it came a profound shift in perception. Enemies could be humane, rational, and lawful, even in the middle of a world war. American policy had created ripple effects the U.S. never intended. By treating POWs according to Geneva standards, down to the wage system recorded in TM 19500, the United States inadvertently planted seeds of goodwill in tens of thousands of German veterans. Many returned to rebuild post-war Germany with a new understanding of democratic systems, rule of law, and economic fairness. Within a decade, West Germany became a stable democracy. Scholars argue that POW experiences in the U.S. played a quiet but meaningful role in this transformation. Even decades after the war, reunions of former German POWs often included stories about camp wages. Men who had fought at Kasserine, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, or the Bulge would reminisce about standing in line at Camp Algona's canteen, deciding whether to buy Bull Durham tobacco or a tin of peaches. They recalled saving scrip to purchase Christmas gifts for fellow prisoners. They remembered how receiving wages helped them rediscover a sense of personal agency after years of marching under orders from a collapsing regime. One POW later said, "When I first received my 80 cents, I thought it was a mistake. When it happened every week, I realized it was a system, and a system is stronger than any ideology." That sentence captures the essence of the entire experience. The payment of wages was not sentimental, it was structural. It signaled that captivity in America was governed not by hatred, but by a functioning set of rules designed to maintain order, uphold law, and preserve dignity. By contrast, many German soldiers returning home found that their own government had abandoned them long before surrender. Their families had gone hungry. Their cities had been sacrificed. Their army had treated them as expendable. America, paradoxically, had treated them as human beings with rights, even as prisoners. As the years passed, the memory hardened into something lasting. Many former POWs later sent letters of thanks to American families they had worked for on farms. Others returned to the United States as immigrants, drawn by the stability and efficiency they had witnessed behind the barbed wire. And all of them remembered the moment they first held U.S. camp scrip in their hands and realized the impossible.
The enemy was paying them fairly, paying them predictably. In a war defined by brutality on every front, this simple act, paying POWs for labor performed, became one of the quietest but most powerful reminders that even in global conflict, humanity could survive inside the machinery of war. For German soldiers who had arrived expecting to be starved, beaten, or forgotten, their time as POW workers in the United States left an indelible truth. Wages meant recognition, routine meant dignity, and lawful treatment meant hope. They walked into captivity as enemies. They walked out with a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives.